So welcome everyone. The speaker today is Marinka Zitnik, the title of her talk is Graph Representation Learning and its Applications to Biomedicine.
Hi everyone, thank you so much Sarah and Henry and Elkan for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And I will start by sharing my screen. Okay, great. So I hope you can see my screen. Today I will talk about graph representation learning with applications to biomedicine. It is a slightly orthogonal topic to the core topology, but I hope you will find it interesting and informative, and it will stimulate some discussions. The idea is that I will speak for around 40 minutes and then would be very, very happy to take questions and have a discussion about the topics presented in the talk. So let's begin. So the way we think of graphs in machine learning is we think of graphs as general representation of complex systems in a very important group of complex systems are systems that arise in biology, in medicine. So here's just an example of a multidimensional, multi-scale representation where we can think of graphs as a general language to represent interactions between individuals in a population, going down to interactions between different phenotypes or diseases within an individual person, and all the way down to interactions between various molecules and molecular components within cells. So really what graphs allow us to do is to bring these different scales together and then have a very general representation of a system such as a cell or individual or even entire population. And they really also allow us to bring together rich multimodal information, multimodal data, meaning different kinds of relationships and associations between these entities or nodes in the graphs can be captured and represented by edges, whether those are physical interactions between molecules in the cell, all the way up to familial friendship relationships between individuals in a population. So in machine learning, when we have graph-based representation of our domain or data sets, a very natural question to ask in recent years have been, how can we really operationalize these data representations in order to extract new insights or make particular new predictions? And so that question then typically leads to developing models that can do deep learning on graphs. And so the idea here is really to start with to take our network shown on the left part of the slide and define powerful set of nonlinear transformations that can convolve information along edges of those graphs. And I will explain that in the later part of the talk, in order to arrive at a particular predictions that might be of interest to us. So for example, we might be interested in predicting properties of nodes in the graph. We might be interested in discovering new relationships and associations between nodes, predicting properties of entire graphs, or just trying to learn what is the underlying metric that describes well the structure of those graphs. And also graphs or networks have turned out to be very powerful data representation, but are challenging to work with for classic deep learning models. And so that has given rise to a particular class of algorithms that has become a predominant paradigm for machine learning on graph structured or relational data sets. And that class of algorithms is called graph neural networks. And so in large part of today's talk, I will discuss and highlight some algorithms that belong to this class that we have developed over years, as well as mention applications of those algorithms. But at the core of these algorithms is the notion of embeddings. So let me explain what embeddings are. So embeddings are low-dimensional compact representations of entities that occur in occurring graph. So imagine we have the graph shown in the left part of the slide. This is our input graph with some nodes and edges. So graph neural network will specify a nonlinear transformation function f that will map every node in the graph to a d-dimensional embedding in Z sub v or Z sub u for node u, where the idea is that the way that a mapping should be done is such that for two nodes that have similar topology in the input graph, they should be represented but by points that are close to each other in the embedding space. So what we want to do is optimize the embedding space in such a way that it will reflect topology of the input graph, meaning that once we have these low-dimensional vector representations of nodes occurring in the graph, we can perform linear algebra operations on them, and that should reflect topology of the input graph. So graph neural networks are then a very efficient strategy and algorithms to generate these low-dimensional embedding vectors. And their core idea is that they map nodes to d-dimensional embeddings such that nodes that have similar network neighborhoods in the input graph are embedded close together in the embedding space. And so there is a variety of variants or different algorithms in GNN space that operationalize the notion of similarity in the graph space in many different ways. So there are many different ways how to characterize similarity of network neighborhoods, and different graph neural networks do that differently. But at the core of all these algorithms is the notion of embeddings of this low-dimensional vector representation, which has really driven the progress of machine learning over the last few years in graphs and beyond. So an important implication of graph neural networks is that over the last 2-3 years, they have really led to substantial improvements in state-of-the-art performance for a variety of prediction tasks. And even more importantly, that we can now apply and use deep learning algorithms much more broadly, not only the context of imaging data sets or sequential data sets, or in terms of computer vision and natural language processing, which are fields that have been revolutionized by the advances offered in deep learning. Now, graph neural networks allow us to really apply and use these powerful models with any graph, and that creates new opportunities in biology and medicine that I'll be focusing on today. So the plan for today's talk is the following. I will start with an overview of a recent algorithm that is called SubGNN, and that will be followed by 2 applications of graph representation learning to biomedical data, where I will be focusing on the question of how can we use these algorithms to identify effective treatment opportunities, and how can we use these algorithms to model emerging diseases, never before seen diseases for which no good treatments exist yet. And so in the first part of the talk, I will focus on SubGNN, and we will discuss this particular graph neural network algorithm. So this method has been published at the last NeurIPS a few months ago. We have a project website up together with all the data sets that were discussed and presented in the paper. You can find that at our lab website. We also have a code base for SubGNN, which is on our GitHub repository. So you can easily go and try out the method on the data sets provided in the paper, or using your data sets. Okay, so let's begin with SubGNN. I'll start with problem formulation. So the goal of the goal in subgraph neural networks is the following. What we want to do is we want to generate embeddings, but not embeddings of individual nodes in the graph, but actually embeddings of entire subgraphs. So what that means is that in the input we have a graph that is shown on the left bottom part of the slide, and on top of that graph we have a large number of subgraphs that are defined by a set of nodes and edges and might have labels that are indicated by different colors that we're using for this for them. So in this particular case, we have a graph with 5 small subgraphs: S1, S2, S3, S4, and S5. And we would think of subgraphs S3 and S4 as they are both colored red to have some similar semantic meaning. So given that, our goal is to learn subgraph embeddings such that the likelihood of preserving subgraph topology is maximized in the embedding space. In the next slide, I will explain what we mean by subgraph topology in this particular case. So in other words, what we aim to achieve is that if two subgraphs, S sub I and S sub j, have similar subgraph topology, in the input graph, they should be embedded close together in the embedding space. So the corresponding embedding vectors for the subgraphs, Z sub S1 and Z sub S2, should be given by points that are nearby in the embedding space. So the core question now becomes, what does it mean that two subgraphs have similar subgraph topology? What do we mean by that? And so here, when I use the term topology, I'm using it in the context of how topology is typically understood in the field of network science, where topology is often characterized through 3 particular aspects that capture the connectivity and structure of graphs. And so these 3 aspects are known as position, neighborhood, and structure. And so these are the 3 aspects of subgraph topology, 3 properties that we want to preserve when generating embeddings of subgraphs. So the way we are approaching that in subgraph neural networks is the following. So our setup is, as we have seen in the previous slide, we have the underlying graph G, on which a large number of subgraphs S are overlaid. So here is just a part of it with one single subgraph, the red one, and we can study its structure from 2 perspectives. We can look at the internal structure and position and neighborhood of that subgraph, meaning how does connectivity look like when we are focusing solely on nodes and edges that define the subgraph. And we can focus on the bordering structure of the subgraph, which is connectivity and relationship between the subgraph and the rest of the graph. And so what that means is that we now have 3 properties or aspects of subgraph topology that we are focusing on: position, neighborhood, and structure. And we want to preserve them from 2 standpoints, in the sense that we want to preserve both internal information as well as information that describes how the subgraph relates to the rest of the graph.
And so Marinka, there's a question in the chat that I wanted to ask. So this is from Brandon Stone, and he asks, by subgraph, do you mean internal or induced subgraph? Meaning if you have 2 vertices in your if you have 2 vertices in your subgraph and there's an edge in the larger graph, then you include it in the subgraph. Thanks.
Exactly, yes. By subgraphs, we mean induced subgraphs, and those subgraphs are given to us by a particular problem that we're trying to solve. So practically, a subgraph could represent a patient in a particular application where the subgraph would be defined by nodes representing genes that are mutated in the patient. So then every patient, say Amy Smith, would have her own subgraph defined by or activated by nodes and used on nodes representing mutated genes in that patient. And so you can imagine then it would have this underlying graph of biological concept, genes and their interactions, and a large number of patients, each represented by distinct subgraph induced on a subset of genes that are mutated in that in those patients. And so then we would want to generate embeddings for patients and predict their outcomes, which would entail predicting properties of the patient subgraphs in this particular application.
Marinka, is it okay if I ask a quick follow-up question?
Sure, go ahead.
Should we be thinking of these subgraphs as distinct? Do they have to be?
Yes, you can think. Yes, you should think of them as distinct. There is possible that subgraphs overlap. That is certainly something that the method can leverage, because two subgraphs that would overlap, what would mean that they would have common edges or common nodes, that would indicate that those two subgraphs are similar, right? So they are in their neighborhood would be very similar because they are proximal in the network. They're in vicinity of each other in the network or in the graph. And so that would then lead to their embeddings being more similar as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let me just very briefly describe this, the three properties. So when we talk about position of a subgraph, what we mean is position of the subgraph with respect to the underlying graph. In particular, the intuition here is, does a subgraph reside in the core central region of the graph, or does it reside in the periphery of the graph? And so that is what position captures. And then we can study that position from the standpoint of border position or internal position, which would be then the relative distance between components of the subgraph, if subgraph has multiple disconnected components. The second aspect is that of neighborhood. A neighborhood is the aspect that characterizes the connectivity in some k-hop neighborhood around the subgraph. So this is the part of the underlying graph that is in the that exists in the immediate vicinity of the graph that we're of graph S, and so we want to capture that information as well. And finally, the structure, final structure is concerned with capturing information on the presence of certain network motifs and higher order structures. For example, is there an overrepresentation of triangles or squares within the graph? Or do we see that in the bordering region of the subgraph, there are many more triangles, squares, or some other network motifs than we would expect by chance? And so that's what the structural channels would capture. Okay, so subgraph neural networks are then defined as following. Given underlying graph G, and we and a set of subgraphs, S sub 1, S sub 2, up to some S sub n, SubGNN specifies a graph neural network or neural message passing architecture that we will discuss next. But that architecture is tasked to generate d-dimensional subgraph representations or embeddings for embedding for every subgraph in our set of subgraphs. And once those embeddings are obtained, SubGNN uses those embeddings or representations to learn a classifier F that will take the subgraphs and predict labels for them, where labels in our case are categories of subgraphs, and we can assume that we have some C number of distinct categories. And the way subgraph neural network method does that, it generates d-dimensional subgraph representations by explicitly considering three distinct properties of subgraph topology that we have seen in the previous slide. Those are neighborhood, structure, and position. Now, a quick note on this problem formulation. Subgraph neural network, the way we just defined it on the previous slide, puts forward a definition of subgraph prediction task. What that means is that the method is concerned with predicting properties or labels of subgraphs. In the context of graphs, in the context of network science, this is a new kind of task that is different from other canonical tasks that exist in graph machine learning. And so the other canonical tasks are node prediction, that are predicting properties of single nodes, link prediction that is concerned with predicting property of a node pair, or graph level prediction that is concerned with predicting property of an entire graph. So the relationship between SubGNN and canonical prediction tasks on graphs is that SubGNN is concerned primarily with modeling subgraphs, these mesoscale structures effectively, in contrast to canonical tasks that are focusing on predicting properties of individual nodes, pairs of nodes, or entire graphs. So this is how SubGNN connects with the rest of with other tasks. You might be wondering, why are subgraphs challenging to model? And there are a variety of reasons why subgraphs are particularly challenging, and I will mention 3 of them here. First, in order to embed subgraphs, we need to make predictions over structures of varying sizes. Distinct subgraphs may have different number of nodes, different number of edges, and there is no particular ordering to those nodes and edges, meaning that our functions that will generate embeddings need to be invariant to the ordering of nodes and edges in subgraphs. These subgraphs, as was mentioned, they are induced by a set of nodes that represent a particular object, and they don't coincide with K-hop neighborhoods, for example, which have been modeled already very effectively in machine learning. They can have rich connectivity structure, both internally as well as externally through interactions with the rest of graph G. So the question is, how can we inject this information effectively into graph neural networks? And finally, these subgraphs that we have, they can be localized, meaning they would reside in one particular region of the graph, such as this schematic that is that shows the background graph in gray, and then the subgraph and its node in red. And we can see that the subgraph is actually localized in one region of the graph. But subgraphs can also be distributed across multiple local neighborhoods, and in that case, this process of generating embeddings becomes even more challenging. So subgraph neural network addresses these challenges, and the way it does that is through an algorithm that has 2 core components. So these 2 core components are the following. In part 1, SubGNN specifies a neural message passing architecture. What that means is that the architecture of SubGNN specifies the way some neural messages, which are represented as vectors, are propagated along edges of the graph. And the way their optimization and propagation is optimized for capturing 3 aspects of subgraph topology. And in the second part, these messages that are propagated and transformed along edges of the graph are actually passed through 3 distinct channels, where each channel captures a separate property of topology, position, neighborhood, and structure. So let me spend the next few minutes describing these 2 parts in greater detail. So part 1, which is that of hierarchical subgraph message passing, operates in the following manner. Let's use this particular example and hypothetical graph and subgraph as a way to explain part 1. In this case, what we have is this: the underlying graph G is shown by white nodes and gray edges. And what is shown is one particular subgraph, S sub 1. And this subgraph S sub 1 consists of two components, S sub 1, which is here, and S sub 1, 2. These are two components of this subgraph. So the way the embedding of that subgraph would be generated is as following. For each of three properties of subgraph topology, position, neighborhood, and structure, we specify a property X, a specific message, M sub X, that message is essentially a vector that is sent or propagated from anchor patches to subgraph components. So anchor patches are small helper subgraphs that are randomly sampled from the rest of the graph. In this picture, they are shown as these as gray subgraphs. Those are randomly sampled during the process of training, and when sampled, they send their message M sub X to subgraph component that we are trying to embed. We have distinct types of anchor patches that are designed specifically to capture position, neighborhood, and structure. And so what is three formulas show is the first one shows in how neural messages are sent from anchor patches A sub X. A sub X, this would be a patch that is sampled to capture property X. When that patch is sampled from the graph, it is embedded. It results in a vector A sub X. This is and that vector is then sent to the subgraph component. And what I mean when we say send to the subgraph component, we essentially that boils down to calculating similarity between the anchor patch and the subgraph component. And that similarity function between subgraph component and an anchor patch is a function that captures the similarity between the patch and the component in the sense of how similar they are in terms of position or neighborhood or structure. So this step is then repeated for many anchor patches that are sampled. So what that means is that there are many messages sent to the subgraph component. So a set of those messages are sent and arrive at the subgraph component. And then the second step of the algorithm is an aggregation function that takes that set of neural messages and aggregates them into a single embedding that captures the structure, position, or neighborhood of that subgraph component. And finally, because this process is repeated for every subgraph component that comprises the subgraph. So to arrive at the final subgraph embedding, these component level representations are aggregated. So why this is called a hierarchical message passing is because you can think of it in the following way, where in the underlying graph G, a large number of anchor patches are sampled. Those anchor patches are used to quantify structure, position, and neighborhood of the subgraph component that we try to embed. The similarity between anchor patches and subgraph components is measured. So this is the first level of passing messages from anchor patches to subgraph components. And then from subgraph components, the messages are aggregated at the subgraph level. So it's really a two-level hierarchy of exchanging neural messages along in the graph. Now, this entire process of two-level hierarchical message passing is split into three distinct processing channels. So what I just described is done independently for position, for neighborhood, and for structure. And that hopefully was clear from the previous slide, where you have noticed that similarity functions and anchor patch sampling functions were all parameterized by a specific property that we want to capture. So SubGNN has three distinct channels. Each channel specifies three functions: a similarity function that weighs messages exchanged between anchor patches and subgraph components, then a sampling function that samples patches from underlying graphs in such a way that the sampled patches are very diverse in terms of their structure or in terms of their position or in terms of their neighborhood, an anchor patch encoder that encodes anchor patches that we can then use to compare with subgraph components. And all these three functions fully specify each channel. They can be either predefined or they can be learned. So to recap this particular part, the key points are that the way the algorithm operates is by exchanging neural messages and vectors along edges in the graph, and as well as between anchor patches and subgraph components. This is done through a two-level hierarchy and through three different channels, each channel capturing the distinct aspect of subgraph topology. So let's now look how this method works. So once we specify the neural message passing architecture, there are a number of trainable parameters or weight matrices that need to be optimized, and those parameters and their values are set during the process of training on a data set. So let's describe the data sets and the setup, and then we'll go into results. So first, we'll start with synthetic subgraph data sets. So the way we generated them is the following. We constructed a large base graph. So this is a graph G on which now many subgraphs are overlaid, and they are overlaid attached to the graph through two different strategies that are either planting or stapling. So when we say planting, that means that a subgraph, say this one in purple nodes, is planted or partially overlaid on top of the graph. Or the subgraph can be simply stapled, which means that it's simply unionized with a particular node that already exists in the graph. So repeating that many times, starting with some base graph and then either planting or stapling these subgraphs, we can generate in a controlled environment a data set that consists of graphs and subgraphs that we can study to understand the failures and successes of our algorithm. So to define subgraph labels, which are represented here by colors of nodes, we calculated a variety of network metrics, and we binned the values of those metrics, and the binned values act as subgraph labels. So for example, we defined a data set density that was a data set where that consisted of the base graph and a large number of subgraphs. Subgraph labels were defined by the density of edges in those subgraphs. So why did we do that? Because now subgraph labels correlate directly with internal structure of subgraphs, because they're fully determined by internal structure of subgraphs. So that allows us to really test whether our structural channel in SubGNN, a neural network, will be really most informative of prediction. And we know exactly what ground truth labels are that we can use to evaluate performance of the model. So results on synthetic data sets are shown on this slide. In rows are different methods for different graph neural network variants. SubGNN is the one that I presented that I discussed today, and there are various ablated simplified variants of SubGNN. In columns, we have 4 data sets, and shown are F1 scores, where the higher value indicates better performance and standard deviation across multiple independent runs. So the conclusion from this is that SubGNN outperforms baseline by a large margin. And in particular, it's important to note that SubGNN outperforms graph level classification methods that think of subgraphs as just separate graphs and cannot really capture any relationships between subgraphs, as well as it outperforms methods that are based on introducing metanodes to represent subgraphs, which is detrimental because it discards information on the bordering structure of subgraphs.
So Marinka, just
yes.
There is one question from the audience. Each property is used simultaneously or sequentially to define the ANs. So that's a question. It looks like it's independently by the slide.
Yes. So correct. Each property is used independently, but they are used in parallel. So the three processing channels are each run in parallel, but they are independent. So their final output, which is an embedding of a subgraph for a given property, those final outputs, the three outputs that we get, are then concatenated to arrive at a single embedding, which is an overall embedding of the subgraph. Okay. Then a next question that we asked was, do SubGNN channels, remember we have three channels for three properties, do they really capture and can they really encode their intended properties? So the way we tested that, and that was very easy to do because we designed our data sets in such a way that they allow us to ask this question, is we perform an ablation study over the channels. What that means is that we took the SubGNN method and we turned off one particular channel, say position channel, and that meaning that we were left only with two channels, neighborhood and structure, and then we asked how the performance of the model changes as a result of that. So what we found is that performance of individual channels very closely aligns with their inductive biases. So for example, on the density data set, that was primarily where subgraph labels were driven by the structure of subgraphs, were determined by the structure of subgraphs. If we remove, turn off the position and neighborhood channel, we see that performance is really poor. But if you use the structural channel, performance of the model is very high, indicating that the structural channel can capture the relevant information, which is exactly what it should happen because the structure is determining subgraph labels. Okay, so the real synthetic data sets allowed us to study the architecture of the algorithm. We then apply the method to several real-world data sets, where in each data set consisted of a base graph and a large number, several thousands at least, subgraphs with different labels. And the experimental setup was the following. First, train SubGNN method through stochastic gradient descent and mini batching to generate subgraph embeddings. Second, use those embeddings to predict subgraph labels. And finally, evaluate performance of the model by comparing predicted labels to ground truth labels of subgraphs. So results are shown on this slide, where we have in the column the different data sets defined used in the model. In the rows are methods. What we found is that SubGNN outperformed baselines by an average of 77% on synthetic data sets, but even more, up to 125% on real-world data sets, meaning that there is really a real need for models that can capture richer notions of subgraph topology, and SubGNN can do that. Therefore, it has substantially better performance on these data sets than other models. So to recap here, SubGNN is a framework for subgraph representation learning. It performs well on synthetic and real-world data sets. And this particular study also puts forward a taxonomy that brings together more classic concepts from network science, such as internal border structure and position of subgraphs, with modern representation learning paradigms. We present 8 new data sets that are a diverse collection of tasks to stimulate research and facilitate research in this area, and all these data sets are available through our GitHub channel. Okay, so I'm actually almost running out of time, but I would spend, if the organizers agree, the next 5 minutes just mentioning one particular application of these algorithms in the context of biomedicine, and then I'll wrap up from there. So the part that I will mention is the search for effective drug treatments, and see how can now we use these methods that we have been discussing in the first part of the talk to identify promising drug treatments. And so the motivation for this work is the problem of drug discovery in development. This is a very tedious, long, expensive process. It takes on average between 12 and 16 years and cost $1 to $2 billion to design a new drug completely from scratch and deliver it to the market for patients to use. Why this is the case is because the entire process is very laborious and it has high failure rate, where in the early phases of the process, a large number of compounds and candidate drugs are tested, and that can go into thousands of compounds that need to be tested for their efficacy and safety. And then those thousands of compounds in early phases slowly trickle down through a preclinical testing, clinical research, all the way to approval stage, where if we are lucky, we get a single compound that is both safe as well as efficacious for patients and can be approved by regulatory agency and then put on the market. So the opportunity that exists here, that presents itself here, is can we use now modern AI-based algorithms to accelerate the process of drug development and discovery, in the sense that these algorithms would identify what are most promising compounds to test, so that we would not need to brute force this search process and test all compounds in a naive manner. So at the core of this problem is then a question: what drug treats what disease? So the way we think of this question is the following. Imagine we have a bipartite graph where nodes are drugs and diseases. Edges between drug-disease nodes indicate treatment relationships. So we have some known edges that represent known information about what drugs exist on the market, what diseases they're being prescribed for. And our goal is to take that information to predict new edges, new edges between drugs and diseases that are indicative of what diseases a new molecule might treat. So the key insight for doing that is actually subgraph-based representation. The way we think of drugs and diseases is not by simple nodes in our bipartite graph, but really the way they are represented by subgraphs. And so every disease, and we have tens of thousands of diseases that are codified in medical knowledge, is given by a subgraph of proteins that are associated with that, whose mutations or alterations are associated with the disease. And every drug is given by a subgraph of proteins that the drug binds to or targets when the drug is administered to a patient. So what is known in pharmacological science is that the drug likely treats a disease if the drug subgraph is close to the disease subgraph in pharmacological space. Okay, so that's great, but what does it mean practically or computationally? So the way we will operationalize the notion of closeness in pharmacological space is that we will use subgraph embeddings. So we will use the paradigm of embeddings to operationalize the concept of closeness or similarity and similarity of network neighborhood between the many disease and drug subgraphs that we have. And to tackle this problem, we worked with our collaborators and put lots of effort into constructing these high quality drug repurposing data sets that capture over thousands of diseases and all drugs that are currently approved on the US market, that give rise to the underlying biological protein network and a large number of disease and drug subgraphs. And the task then is, we have as our input data, we have a large number of drug disease pairs. So every disease is a subgraph, every drug is a subgraph, and the relationships are known treatment relationship. Our task is, first, learn embeddings for drug and disease subgraphs. Second, use those embeddings and combine them to predict potential associations or links between those subgraphs in such a way that those links are indicative of possible therapeutic treatments, meaning which are referred to as indications or contraindications. And so I will conclude with this particular slide on one result of using this algorithm in the context of drug discovery, in particular drug repurposing, that is concerned with the question of how can we take drugs that exist on the market and we can repurpose them for a new disease or for an emerging disease, for disease with no good treatments, that does not yet have any good treatments. So we obtained from our collaborators at Stanford School of Medicine a set of drug disease pairs that represented drugs that were repurposed at over the last 2 decades, and we use that as ground truth information for our model. So the way to read this table is, let's take an example, 4th row from the bottom. This describes carvedilol, which was a drug that was repurposed for Chagas disease by biomedical community. So we wanted to ask how well or how highly is carvedilol ranked by our predictive model when that predictive model does not know that carvedilol was actually repurposed for Chagas disease. So the result was that the model ranked carvedilol as 9th most highly highly ranked, or the best candidate for Chagas disease out of 5,000 drugs that were in the system. And so the same interpretation applies to other drug disease pairs that I'm showing here. In all cases, the successfully repurposed drugs were actually predicted close to the top of our prediction list, indicating really promising opportunities and promising results that led to follow-up work with our biological collaborators in the lab, including work, for example, for COVID-19 last year, where our team was part of several task forces that led to experimental validation of predictions made by the algorithms in really wet labs and labs that worked with live viruses. So I'll wrap up here. To summarize, today we talked about about graph representation learning broadly, and with the focus on a recent algorithm and advancements on modeling subgraphs from a representational standpoint and embeddings. And then I highlighted one particular application of those methods to biomedical data, where we were looking at identifying promising drug opportunities. If anyone here on the call became interested and intrigued by the algorithms or data sets that I talked about, feel free to check out these resources. That are resources that some of them were prepared by our lab. We have a set of tutorials for graph machine learning, as well as resources that are very prominent and popular in the community. DGL, or Deep Graph Library, and PyTorch Geometric are the solid frameworks that allow you to try out and implement these models. And the data sets that I mentioned are also public and available through data sets, through data set collections. One of them is TDC, Therapeutics Data Commons, that you can access at tdcommons.ai. And the second one is the Open Graph Benchmark that you can access through ogb.stanford.edu, where we have released a large number of AI-ready data sets for community to use to develop new algorithms. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions and engage in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so time for questions.
I have a question. So
Chat.
when you look at these subgraphs, you said, like at the beginning, you're like, oh, we're looking at induced subgraphs. Could you define your subgraphs that you're looking at, like in training, with like weights on the edges instead? So like, can I cluster things whose weight, I don't know, of the nodes is like a certain mean or something like that?
Yes, so thank you, Brandon. That's a great question. Yes, we could do that. The way to do that in machine learning is through a mechanism that is called attention mechanism. That essentially what it represents, it operates on weighted representations of nodes or subgraphs or graphs, and then those weights serve as attention weights, giving the model some clues about how strongly it should focus or attend on a particular node. So the way that would change the problem formulation would be to say that subgraphs are not given by an induced set of nodes and edges, but are given by some set of nodes and edges that are also come up with their weights that might be given to you by the data set. They might be weights representing the confidence of certain nodes participating in the subgraph, or there might be weights that are learned. And the way to implement that practically is through attention mechanism.
Nice, thanks.
More questions? So there is one question in the chat window. I was wondering if this method works for regression problems too.
That's a great question, Negin. Yes, the methods work for regression problems too. And the modification is very simple. So instead of training a classifier as a last layer of our neural transformation, one would use a function that outputs a regress of that makes a continuous value predictions rather than categorical assignment of subgraphs to labels.
I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Of course.
This is a somewhat irresistible question for a topologist, and maybe it's unnatural from the project's perspective, but so distinguishing between, a triangle and a graph and a filled-in triangle, you could extend this to a simplicial complex, and I'm a little bit at a loss at the moment about what it might represent in a biomedical context, but do you think that's a meaningful generalization and that the framework that you have applies to situations with higher simplices in there?
Yes, so this is a wonderful question. There is actually a discussion point just published a few days ago in Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics on this topic of how can then simple edge connectivity versus simplicial complexes inform some questions in public health. And in particular, that was studied from the context of pandemic, where one can define those simplicial complexes as complexes on nodes that represent individuals that were in close contact with each other. So a closed triangle would then mean that they were for some amount of time in close contact with each other as a group, rather than as just individual pairs or just pairs of people. And so that has then implications for estimating important epidemiological constants for modeling the spread of the virus through population. So perhaps at the high level, what I would say is that I think there are many opportunities that and important gaps that we need to fill between network science and then kind of machine learning way of looking at the graphs, and then the concepts that come from algebraic topology, where we have these much richer notions of topology, looking at first, second order, higher order topology. And the core question is that from the data standpoint, it's really, we often don't know how to make sense of second, third order topology. How can we think of voids and holes in these data sets, right? And if I can make one step further, I'm very excited with these topics. And then I've been thinking recently about, well, how can we leverage some of the principles from algebraic topology in machine learning? That's a very exciting topic nowadays. In the last few ICML NeurIPS conferences, which are leading AI conferences, there were organized workshops specifically on how can we translate ideas and knowledge from algebraic topology and inform design of these graph machine learning algorithms. And it seems that the core of this question is the notion that in machine learning, we're very much focused on dense regions of our graphs. So we look at communities, which are set of nodes that are highly interconnected with each other because they often correspond to people that are friends with each other or proteins that interact with each other and so on. However, then calculating these topological features like holes or voids seems exactly the opposite. We are essentially characterizing this empty space in graphs, and how long does it survive and what does it mean? And so we don't have very good intuition in network science and graph representation learning what those features correspond to. And kind of that makes it also quite challenging for people to think about, well, what are then the applications and the mechanisms that we should implement in our message passing frameworks that would capture these higher order topological features in kind of in strict definition of what topology is, rather than kind of more hand-waving definition that is that we use in, say, machine learning or network science.
Thank you. That's a really intriguing answer. And yeah, just trying to think about what it would mean in the pandemic network for there to be a void is an interesting question. And that's very cool.
Any other questions for Marinka?
I have kind of a follow-up to that. So in between graphs, the simplicial complex line hypergraph, they don't have the full structure of
I cannot hear you, Emily. I cannot hear you well.
Yeah, it's very difficult to hear.
And then 1 second, let me get.
How about now?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay,
Oh,
sorry.
Yeah.
Forgot I was using my laptop microphone. So a follow-up question, in between graphs and simplicial complex lies hypergraphs. They don't have the full structure of requiring, you know, a simplex needs all of its sub-simplices to be a simplicial complex, and a hypergraph doesn't have that requirement. And so I wonder if there's anything, and I know there are applications for hypergraphs in the biological domain. I've done some work in that area. And I'm just wondering if you could say anything about how some of these methods might apply, not when there's this rich topology necessarily, but when there's these more rich connectivity structures.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And there are some biomedical applications where it is where hypergraphs are better representation than simplicial complexes, and vice versa, in the sense where we know that in order for an object to exist, like a protein complex that would consist of a large number of proteins, not only that set of proteins need to all be present in a certain configuration, but also their subsets need to satisfy certain properties, right? And when that is the case, then the representation based with simplicial complexes is a natural way to represent such data, because then we can model or encode in our model additional constraints that come from subsets and all enclosing subsets of proteins that form a complex, also satisfying certain constraint. That is something that cannot be directly modeled with hypergraphs. Now, in the context of model that I presented, the structural channel is actually the channel that is concerned with capturing higher order network structures or network motifs. And the way it does that is by using set transformation. And currently it does not capture simplicial complexes. It only works with really network motifs, triangles and squares, and encodes them in such a way that we get an estimate or a signature essentially of how many motifs of certain shape, up to 5 nodes, do we see within a subgraph or in the surrounding of a given subgraph. And so that is then a signature of the subgraph structure that is used to compare the structure between subgraphs to the structure between anchor patches and define what is a good representation of the subgraph from the structural standpoint. It would be very great and fantastic if would be possible to extend that work to really take into account simplicial complexes rather than hypergraphs, because it would be very useful for some certain applications to encode these additional constraints in the model that are presented by simplicial complexes and not hypergraphs.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. So I will stop the recording now, and Marinka, thank you again. And then all the, if you have more questions, they can happen offline.